Does science point toward or away from God?
Scientists all down the ages have been so impressed by the order in the universe. Nature seems to be designed, first of all, that it works in a repeatable, rational way, and that gives us a clue that there's a mind behind it. The God who designed this world also included a bit of disorder at just the right level so that we've got natural laws that we can rely upon, but that not everything is totally determined.
Something that I think is super important is in science the importance of doubt. Doubt is something that we really value, we really treasure. But I think the Bible really speaks against doubt. Those that doubt should not expect anything from the Lord.
Quoting one of my heroes, Augustine, who said that all truth is God's truth, and that includes scientific truth. Both as a scientist and as a Christian, I entertain doubts. God gave us a mind to think things through.
We wouldn't have got here without catastrophes, multiple mass extinction events. These are the engines of our creation, and they are incredibly violent. Very hard to believe that a good God would be behind that.
Well, I have to confess that's one of the most difficult questions that I struggle with as a Christian.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sam McKee. I am the Associate Tutor in History and Philosophy of Science at Manchester Metropolitan University, and I'm a molecular biology cancer researcher at the University of Reading. And it is an immense privilege for me as a former student of this school to host this live broadcast of Premier Unbelievable at John Hampden Grammar School here today, joined also by students from Wycombe High School. We're here today for a fascinating discussion between two eminent gentlemen on the question, does science point toward or away from God? To my left is Professor Paul Ewart, Emeritus Professor of Physics at Oxford University. Dr. Ewart was an Associate Professor and Head of Atomic and Laser Physics and Fellow of Worcester College at Oxford University, where his research spanned atomic and quantum physics, nonlinear optics, and laser physics. His practical accomplishments are quite incredible, and they've touched many areas of our daily lives. He was until recently head of Christians in Science, and he was the director of the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion in Cambridge, with its associated journal, Science and Christian Belief. To my right is Phil Halper, who is a popular science communicator and collaborator. His YouTube channel has over 66,000 subscribers, which regularly welcomes scientists and academics to address claims about religion made by apologists. Shortly, his new book, co-authored with Professor Niash Afshordi. Yeah, I even practiced that. My apologies, Professor. Will be released by University of Chicago Press. Its title is Battle of the Big Bang, The New Tales of Our Cosmic Origins. And we look forward to a stimulating debate on that as well. He is a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society, and his YouTube series, Before the Big Bang, has several million views. Many of his remarkable astronomy photos have featured across the world's media. And both our gentlemen here have published many academic papers in peer-reviewed journals. Gentlemen, a warm welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Does science point towards or away from God? Paul, I want to start with you. If you could briefly tell us, from your perspective and from your work, both with Christians in Science and the Faraday Institute, why you think science points towards God?
Well, I think I'd refer to my own work as a physicist, first of all, in that I've always been interested in science, particularly astronomy when I was a kid, and that got me into physics. I got lured into doing laboratory astrophysics for my PhD, and then turned out no one was really interested in that, but I got into other interesting stuff. And what I really love about science was you get to discover the way God's world works. And what, not just me, but scientists all down the ages have been so impressed by the order in the universe, not just here on Earth, but all the way to the farthest reaches of the universe. We see laws of physics working the same everywhere, and that's really remarkable. And so that the nature seems to be designed, first of all, that it works in a repeatable, rational way, and that gives us a clue that there's a mind behind it. And that's not just an opinion from a Christian or a religious person, but lots of my atheist colleagues have also looked at the order that we see in the universe and are impressed by the indication, the suggestion that there's a mind behind this. And actually, almost all the classical philosophers down the ages have thought of mind as being there before matter. So that science that we discover the laws of nature, that implies that there's a lawgiver, as it were, a mind behind the universe. But then a few years ago, I got into a bit of science where I was looking at not order, but disorder. And I thought, I thought everything was supposed to be ordered. And then actually, the more I thought about it, I found that you really need a little bit of disorder in the universe as well, because otherwise, if everything works according like clockwork rules, then things can get stuck. If everything's totally determined, then things get stuck. And so you need a little bit of disorder here and there to keep things moving smoothly. And so that really struck me, that the God who designed this world also included a bit of disorder at just the right level, so that we've got natural laws that we can rely upon, but that not everything is totally determined. And so another piece of the jigsaw fell into place, if you like, that both the order and the disorder both pointed to a mind behind the universe.
Excellent, thank you. Phil, from your own work, why do you think science points away from God?
So there's a few reasons. Firstly, if we should say what we mean by God, I think. So I'm going to be talking about the Christian God because my interlocutor here is a Christian, so I think that's the appropriate God to talk about. So the first thing, of course, that science discovered was that the natural history of our world doesn't really match what's in the Bible. The creation story doesn't look right. There wasn't a global flood. Even archaeologists doubt whether the Exodus happened. So we see that there's this mismatch. Now, of course, you could say it was all metaphor and poetry, but you could have had that poetry and still have gotten like the order of creation right. Why did the stars have to be created in the Genesis story after plants? So that's the first thing. Second thing is the discovery of evolution has shown that complexity doesn't imply a mind. That people think, well, it's either random or it's a mind. And what Darwinian evolution shows is that it can be neither. That naturalistic processes can give rise to complex things from very simple origins. Evolution also undermines belief in God because what it shows us is how violent the creative process is. So we wouldn't have got here, without millions of years of evolution, without catastrophes like the catastrophe that wiped out the dinosaurs, and that wasn't even the worst one. So there have been multiple mass extinction events. This and evolution, these are the engines of our creation, and they are incredibly violent. Very hard to believe that a good God would be behind that. And of course, the theologians of the past, they didn't know about this, but science has uncovered this. And the third thing that I've been involved with is I've been involved with some research that seems to show that animals do feel pain, even fish feel pain. And what we see throughout nature is how much animals suffer horrendously. Hundreds of millions of years of animal suffering before humans ever existed. And the traditional explanation for suffering given by Christianity is that it all came about because of human sin. But what science has shown is that that's false. And also, of course, there's lots of passages in the Bible that show cruelty to animals by God. So, for example, the 10th plague, it's not just the firstborn Egyptian children that are killed, but also the domestic animals, the cats and the dogs. Now, Aristotle looked at these sorts of passages. In fact, he mentions the story where Jesus exorcised a demon into a herd of 2,000 pigs that all run off a cliff and drown. And Aristotle said, sorry, not Aristotle. Augustine said, well, he's showing us a lesson. He's showing us, that animal suffering isn't really an issue. Maybe they don't feel pain. We shouldn't really care. But science, I think, has revealed that they do. So those are some pointers away from God.
Okay, so we've set our table here, and we've already got a great deal that we can talk about. Actually, I'll come straight back to you, Phil, if that's all right. What do you see as the biggest areas of conflict? You've mentioned quite a few there, but are there any more, or what do you see as the most problematic ones?
I think, there are several. Of course, rather than just repeat myself, let me give something that I think is super important, and that is in science the importance of doubt. That doubt is something that we really value, we really treasure. That when the Higgs boson was discovered, they didn't announce the discovery until they'd got a very, very high level of statistical significance. We're talking about the chances of it being found by a random accident, like 1 in 3.5 million. Imagine that. 1 at 3 million. No, we're still not going to declare a discovery. We have to wait till we get to 1 and 3.5 million. But I think the Bible, at least in certain passages, really speaks against doubt. So, for example, in the book of James, we see the comment, you must believe and not doubt. The one who doubts is like a wave on the sea. It's something like tossed by the wind, and it says those that doubt should not expect anything from the Lord. They are double-minded and unstable in all that they do. That, and of course, doubting Thomas, not exactly the hero of the story. So I think what science has really done is show us, the importance of rigor, of having doubts, and where people believe things without that rigor, we get into trouble. So people that deny climate change, that deny vaccines, they're running governments now. It's a disaster for the world, and those people were put in power to some extent by religious communities.
Well, we won't turn this into a politics debate,
Right.
I promise that. But what you're saying here is it's not just topics in science
Right.
or branches of science.
Yeah.
You're saying the very process of doubt is very valuable to science, but is sort of looked down on in religion, and that those two are problematic for advancing science there.
Yes, when we say religion, we have to be specific, certain types of religion. So here we're talking about Christianity and particularly evangelical Christianity. So it does vary between religions and even types of Christianity. But
Sure. Excellent. Thank you. Well, with the Higgs boson, we started jumping over into sort of your area of physics here with atomic and quantum physics and those sorts of things. But I want to ask you, Paul, is the idea of conflict between science and religion valid to you?
No.
Could you maybe expand on that a little bit? That would be good.
Okay.
Why do you think that there's not a conflict between science and religion? Either, you can take this where you want to go, either historically or in practice, or some of the areas which Phil's mentioned.
Well, let me first of all say that actually I agree with a lot of what Phil's been saying about doubt and so on. And also quoting one of my heroes, Augustine, who said that all truth is God's truth. And that includes scientific truth. So as a Christian, I welcome scientific truth. And both as a scientist and as a Christian, I entertain doubts. Even in my faith, I entertain doubts. Because God gave us a mind to think things through, not just to say, I believe it whether I really do or not. We really need to think carefully about what we believe about God. And you're absolutely right, we need to think about clearly what our idea of God is. And I share Phil's confusion, as it were, and doubts about the picture that we get of God from the early parts of the Bible. And I think that's understandable because in those days they had what we might call a pre-Christian idea of God. It was colored by their culture, and so one of the problems about this conflict is often not between the Bible and science, but some interpretations of the Bible. People who take it as a literal text, as it were, and that creates all sorts of problems. Moral problems as well about the kind of things that are said to be okay in the Old Testament, which we now know when we see it through the lens of Jesus Christ, not to be God's way of doing things. So you need to sort of step back and see the big picture of what the Bible is saying. And we see a progressive revelation from very rudimentary ideas about God through to what the prophets taught us about loving your neighbor and so on, up fulfillment in Jesus Christ. And so we see this gradual revelation, as it were, of the nature of God. And I think that what it calls us to is to think carefully and to take the big picture in. And some bits of the Bible are actually not Christian. And I have this little picture of the Bible as a kind of like a stream flowing. And to begin with, it's very turbulent. And if you ever look at a stream, sometimes there's general flow this way, but in some parts, the actual flow is going the wrong way. It's going upstream instead. And those bits are actually wrong. And they're corrected later on because the general flow is leading up to what we know about God in Jesus. That's the best revelation we can get in a human form. And God does that not to overwhelm us with evidence and force us into belief, but to say, here's what I want you to be like. I want you to be like this person, Jesus. And if you ask me, I'll help you. And that takes a step of faith. But we take the evidence, the pointers that we see in science and in other aspects of our life, and then we make a commitment, and then we begin to deal with our doubts. And our doubts are not replaced with certainty, but with confidence. You get to know a person, you don't know everything about them, but you commit to them in friendship. And in a sense, you give them the benefit of the doubt to begin with. And as you get to know them more, your doubts get less. You get more confident in that relationship. And that's what it means to me to be a Christian. Not that I'm absolutely certain of everything. I don't think we ever get that. But there's enough to be going on with, as it were, to make that step of commitment and trust, and then to experience God in your life.
Well, we've raised 2 points here when we've been talking about conflict in science, and Phil has raised the challenge of doubt being of vital importance for the practice of science. And you mentioned in your first statement about order and what order meant to you. Can actually your faith, for you personally, but also in general, inform your practice of science?
Well, yes. Obviously, intellectual honesty is important, and that's a common factor between science and Christianity. We don't tell lies. We go with the evidence, and we're open to it and follow it where it leads. But also there are other questions that are beyond the actual practice of science, is what we do, what kind of science we do. The one particular issue that I faced at one stage when funding was very difficult, a lot of money became available for science research during the reign, if I may call it that, of Ronald Reagan in the United States. And lots of money went into the Star Wars program, and you could get money to do almost anything, really, especially if you're working with lasers, as I was. And so I was tempted, in a way, to get big grants, £1 million, to do research. But that would have fed into a program that was going to kill people. And as a Christian, I felt that was wrong. And so I did not apply for that money. And so my Christian ethics, as it were, directs the kind of work I do, the kind of science I do. I want to do it for the benefit of humanity, not to make weapons that kill people. So my Christian faith has informed the kind of science I do.
Wow, that's really interesting. But let me flip it over to you, Phil, and ask you, do you think that it's important for the future of science, from where we are now and where we dream of going, that religion takes a step back in public life? Is science going to be benefited as religion gets out of the way?
So again, it depends on the religion. So I think for Christianity, what we see, surveys have been done on this. For example, 90% of atheists accept climate change. About 45% of Christians do, about 30-something% of evangelical Christians do. So you get similar results when people look at evolution as well. About 90% of atheists accept evolution. Amazingly, 10% don't. That's pretty crazy. Nevertheless, you get similar sorts of patterns. So this is certainly a problem for the advancement of science. And also that may breed distrust of experts, because, hey, if the experts are lying to us about evolution, then they probably are lying to us about climate change and all kinds of other topics. So it can breed distrust in experts, not for all Christians. I don't want to claim, this is a universal feature of Christianity, absolutely not. But nevertheless, those probabilities are there. 90% acceptance, climate change for atheists, half that for Christians, a third of that for evangelical Christians. So that is clearly a problem. And if those beliefs were to be dropped and someone became an atheist, well, it's not guaranteed that they will embrace science, but it seems to be more probable that they will. So it certainly, I think, would be helpful, yes.
Would you mind addressing what Paul said earlier in terms of a Christian worldview, or a Judeo-Christian worldview, a sort of a monotheistic worldview, expects order in the cosmos, expects order in nature, and so allows for an openness and expectation of science, or what Paul said about interpretation, and maybe it being more a problem of fundamentalism? Yeah,
okay. So let's deal with one thing at a time, the order. Does religion really expect order? I mean, certainly this looks a bit post hoc to me. It's like you've seen order, and so you go, that's what God would have wanted. It's a bit like you've got a dart on a board and then you draw a circle around it, go bullseye, just where I meant to hit. It seems to me that God is supposed to have free will, and he's supposed to be omnipotent, so he can do anything. And he's supposed to do miracles. So, of course, the more miracles he does, the less order there is. So why should we expect order under God? I don't see it follows. I can understand why, in retrospect, you see, okay, I see the order, God must have wanted it. But let's not forget that people had posited order way before people believed in Christianity. I mean, Anaximander, about 600 years BC, posited that there were natural laws that govern things rather than, if you see a lightning strike or an earthquake, it's probably because of natural laws, it's not because of an angry God. And of course, even today, there are Christians that say, well, AIDS is not caused by an impersonal virus, it's a punishment from God against homosexuals. We see Christians saying that today. Not all, and I'm sure Paul wouldn't sign up to that, but we do see that. So I don't think that order is a prediction from Christianity. And then the second one was...
About interpretation.
The interpretation, yeah, okay. So of course, now the fact that there is this mismatch between Genesis and what science has revealed has to be explained. Now, of course, you can say, oh, we shouldn't interpret the text literally. But the question is, why were there errors in it? Why does the Bible mention that there's a solid dome of the sky? It could have easily, if there's some theological truth that it wishes to communicate, surely it could have communicated that without mentioning that there's a solid dome of the sky. Other creation myths have that. They don't have the solid dome of the sky. It doesn't. So, for example, a Chinese creation myth says there was a great emptiness, then there was energy, then there was yin and yang, which you might think as matter and antimatter. Maybe you could make that analogy. Then it says the universe was opaque, which is exactly right. The universe was opaque. It didn't really have to say that the stars were created on day 4, after the creation of plants. Surely whatever theological truth it was trying to communicate could have been communicated without those errors. And what's more, I'll say one more thing about this. God would know that in the future, people will look at those texts and some of them will interpret them literally. Some atheists will be turned off from a relationship with God because maybe they think it's literal. Some theists will be turned away from science because they think it's literal. So couldn't he have guided the text just to have less errors and avoid all this incredible conflict? It seems to be he could have, and the simplest explanation for why there's so many errors is that God isn't involved in the text at all. This is mythology.
Well, so Paul, there's loads we can respond to there, but I want to start with the addressing of order, because Phil's said actually that order is this a post hoc rationalization, and with that the problem of miracles. Are miracles sort of a change of the order in nature? I'm aware also that you've said elsewhere that you really believe that modern science in the West really came out of the Christian framework. Yeah, people like Isaac Newton and Robert Boyle, Francis Bacon. So if you can answer those questions, but also sort of maybe ground that into your answer too.
Okay, well, let's go back to my idea of the big picture of where this idea of order in nature came from. Certainly there were individuals, you mentioned one or two, would have thought of that kind of idea. But the general thrust in Greco-Roman mythology was that there were various gods behind things, and these gods could do what they wished, and they were kind of capricious, and therefore you couldn't predict what might happen. And there was no point then looking for order, because nature was under the control of different gods. The gods of the sky, the sea, and the forest. And various religions had different kind of ideas of gods. And therefore, because they could just do whatever they wished in a capricious way, there was no sense of there being order. It actually was either chaos or some capriciousness on the parts of the gods. Now, gradually over time, and the Greeks fed something into this, of course, into the development of science, and the Muslim world also contributed algebra, for example, as a calculation methods. But really the tide started to turn in the early Middle Ages, when medieval philosophers began to interpret the Bible in the sense of looking for the order that was imposed on the world by the Creator. And Kepler, for example, thought of himself as thinking God's thoughts after him. And the purpose of the job of a scientist, Kepler said, was to discover the order that God has put there and written in the language of mathematics. So gradually, it was in this Christian culture that had faith that the world was created by a rational God. It made sense then to look for some order, that there would be natural laws to find. And then the other key point was that Francis Bacon decided, or introduced the idea of doing experiments, because before then there was a kind of fear of fiddling with nature, because you might get punished by the god if you cut trees down to count the rings or something. You know, the tree god might zap you or something like that. There was a kind of fear associated with doing experiments. And Francis Bacon said, no, you can actually, rather crudely said, you can even torture nature. That was the culture of the day. If you want to get the truth, torture somebody. But that was nonsense. But the idea was that you could do experiments and actually test your ideas. And so Bacon was the father of experimental science, and he was a Christian. And he also said that, you know, a little bit of natural philosophy, as they called it, science, inclines you to atheism, but a deeper delving into science brings you about to religion. And that's the kind of thing that motivated people like Kepler and Newton, Galileo, and succeeding scientists who believed that there was an order to be found and did experiments to test them. So I think the general thrust agrees that it's not an accident that modern science grew up in a Christian culture. Right. With other streams flowed into it, of course, and contributed, as I'm saying. But the general thrust was, here was a world made by a rational God. And in some sense, we share something of God's nature. That's what the Bible means by being made in his image. And therefore, our minds can understand something of it. And this also is interesting for me because perhaps the greatest scientist of the last century was Albert Einstein. And he said that the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. Why can this tiny little thing, our brains, understand anything about the world? And for the atheist, you have to come some kind of evolutionary explanation for that. And I can see that as a mechanism whereby our rationality has developed. But underneath, it must go right back to the rationality of God. There's something in us that allows us to understand the world he has made, because he wants us to see something of him in the world he has made, as a pointer, as it were, to lead us into finding out more. And it's his pointer, okay? And we've got to move in that direction to find him.
May I ask, I want to address the miracles thing, because I think it's a good point that Phil raised. Are miracles a disruption of the order of nature and therefore problematic for this idea of science and religion being in harmony?
Well, I don't believe so. Again, let me go back to what we think of as miracles in the Bible, for example. It's very interesting that the Old Testament, most of the Bible was written in the Hebrew language. The Hebrew language does not have a word for supernatural. Everything that happens is natural for God. And so I see miracles not as a breaking of the natural laws, but as God being able to use other laws that perhaps we don't know about. And we've actually seen that in science as well. That, for example, Lord Kelvin came from Belfast, actually, I'm ashamed to say, one of the greatest scientists in the last century. He said, heavier than air flying machines are impossible.
Okay.
Right, because the law of gravity means everything's going to fall down. What he didn't know was about the law of aerodynamics. There's another law that can overcome gravity if you shape the wings properly. So, and for example, I'm sitting on this chair, I don't fall through it, because there's electromagnetic forces that push atoms apart if you try to go through them, okay? So we can't walk through walls. We don't fall through the floor because of the electromagnetic force that keeps stuff apart. I got involved in an experiment a few years ago with some colleagues in Paris where we got little helium atoms and we shone our lasers on them and turned the nuclei, little spins, all to point in the same direction. and then they all became totally identical. And the laws of quantum mechanics say that identical particles like that will pass right through each other. And that's what happened. The gas changed when we did this. So the laws of quantum mechanics overcame the classical laws of electricity. And that was like a miracle, that these atoms would pass right through each other. So I see that as, if a miracle is God using laws that we have as yet undiscovered, perhaps some will never fully understand, and God's infinite. But we see clues, that the natural laws that we get used to can sometimes be overcome by another law, as it were, that can cancel it out in some way. That's not breaking the law, it's using a different law. See what I mean?
Yeah.
So everything is natural to God.
Before we move on to your topic of the Big Bang, I want to give you an opportunity to respond or comment on anything that Paul's just said there, Phil.
Yeah, so the problem is, of course, you could imagine that there are hidden laws that, that's how Jesus rose from the dead and walked on water and so on. But I think the religious tradition predominantly says this is just an act of God's free will. He can do anything. There are lots of passages in the Bible that says, no, God can do anything. So I don't think you need to appeal to hidden laws. The idea is that God is omnipotent. He can do anything. Now, the problem here is that it seems to, I think that does conflict with the idea that nature has these great regularities, because the more that God intervenes, the less regularities there are. And it would be good, if you want to claim credit for these regularities and the deviations from the regularities, it'd be good if you could predict, well, where does the breakdown happen? But of course, there's nothing like that. That's why I think this is post hoc reasoning. Okay.
Well, without giving away all the spoilers for your upcoming book, and I'm aware you're going to have a discussion on your book, The Battle of the Big Bang, The New Tales of Our Cosmic Origins, coming out in a couple of months. Would you like to explain, in as best you can, as concisely as you can, why you think the Big Bang requires no creator or designer whatsoever?
Well, there was an idea popular in the latter part of the 20th century that the Big Bang was the beginning of time. And this was proven by theorems by Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose. And if there's a beginning of time, well, you could have a naturalistic explanation for that. But there's an alternative, which is that it wasn't the beginning at all. And what's happened in recent years is that people have found flaws in Hawking and Penrose's theorem. Even Hawking and Penrose themselves have abandoned it. And so this view that the Big Bang wasn't the beginning has become more popular. We still don't know, but there are lots of exciting ideas now being explored by physicists as to what might have triggered the Big Bang. So, for example, it could have been part of a multiverse, or maybe there was a timeless state before the Big Bang, in some sense. Maybe it was born from black holes producing new universes. One of the craziest ideas is that space and time can curve back on itself and actually form a loop. So maybe the universe could have sort of become its own parent, like you might see in a time-traveling sci-fi movie. There's all kinds of very, very interesting ideas. And the idea that the laws of physics break down at the Big Bang, I think, is no longer very popular anymore. So there's no need for a creator God. Now, I don't want to claim that we know any of these theories are right. That's why we're calling it the Battle of the Big Bang, because this is a very active area of debate and lots of interesting tensions between different cosmologists with different ideas. But that's what makes science exciting, and no need to posit a creator.
Okay. Paul, over to you on the Big Bang, but also I want to try and fit in some discussion of the topic of fine-tuning as well, two topics you're familiar with. What do you have to say to multiverses and loops and those sorts of things?
Well, I mean, Phil has very eloquently indicated what an active and fascinating field this is at the moment. And I have to confess, being a little bit of an outsider of the field, that I get a little bit of confusion where the science stops, where the physics stops and the metaphysics begins, because a lot of these ideas are really pure speculation, and in some senses aren't really science. I mean, for example, the multiverse idea itself inherently is not testable, because these other universes have no contact with ours. There's no causal link between them. If there was, If we could feel the effect of another universe on ours, then it would simply become part of our universe, and the universe would be bigger. And so if there's no way of contacting these other universes, we can't do science, we can't test it. And therefore, in that sense, it's not conventional science. It's interesting stuff, but at the end of the day, what we're talking about here are mechanisms for how we got to where we are. And the mechanism doesn't tell you the meaning. We can figure out that we humans have the shape and form we are as a result of Darwinian evolution. I have no issue with that. That's the mechanism by which it came about. Now, there are other issues that you raise in terms of the morality of it that we could discuss. But again, I want to see this in the bigger picture of what God might be doing. There may be other dimensions that we need to consider. So the ideas of where the universe came from, out of a Big Bang or not, is a discussion about the mechanism. Whereas the book of Genesis is not really talking about the mechanism. It's talking about the meaning behind it. It's answering Leibniz's question, why is there something rather than nothing? Or what Stephen Hawking said, what is it that breathes the fire into these equations of M theory or whatever theory we've got? Why is there something that these equations describe at all? Why does anything exist? And that's not really a scientific question. It's a metaphysical question that we need to address in a different way. And actually, I think science should teach us that, because when you go to investigate something with science, you have a think about what kind of thing it is you're looking for, or what you want to measure. And so you don't measure the weight of something with a ruler, okay? You use the right method to discover what you're looking for. And if you can't find it, then you try something else that might fit the nature of the thing you're looking for. And so that's where trying to find God using science runs into limitations. Science will only take us so far. It'll tell us about the mechanism. It won't tell us about the meaning behind it. To find that, you've got to think about it in a different way.
Okay. Very briefly, before we get on to questions, I'd love to give you a chance to respond to that, and also why you think fine-tuning and the anthropic principle and things like that aren't really pointers towards God at all.
So first of all, I'd just like to reply to what Paul said about these ideas being, I think, pure speculation was the term. So take, for example, the multiverse. I think there are degrees of speculation. So it is true that the multiverse is speculative. I don't want to claim it's a sort of fact of science. It certainly isn't. But it does seem to be an implication of something called inflationary cosmology, which is the leading candidate for a theory of how galaxies form. And in fact, if you go on NASA's website, they say we have evidence for inflation. Now, that's somewhat debated by cosmologists, and in the book we go into the debates about inflation. But certainly there's at least a good scientific case to be made for inflationary cosmology, and that predicts that we live in a multiverse. So if we can test inflationary cosmology, it would provide evidence for a multiverse, I think. And in fact, I interviewed George Eustathiou, who was the cosmology spokesperson on the European Space Agency's €1 billion project to map the cosmic microwave background. And he said, we have found evidence for literally a multiverse because there's types of inflationary cosmology that really look like very, very precisely suited to generate a multiverse. And the data seems to match those models. And in fact, the critics of inflation say, yes, the inflation leads to a multiverse, and we don't like a multiverse. So I think there are degrees of speculation. I think it's less speculative than what Paul was suggesting. And I think in principle you can test it, because although you won't see another universe, what you could find evidence for is the universe generating mechanism. And if that mechanism in theory produces many universes, and we find evidence that it produced our universe, then that would be evidence for a multiverse. Now, again, I don't want to claim a multiverse is real. It is speculative, but less so than what Paul was saying, I think.
To you, is a multiverse more probable as an explanation than the Big Bang?
Well, we have to define what we mean by Big Bang. So there's sort of two definitions that we unpack in the book. One is that the Big Bang is a theory that says the universe evolved from a hot, dense state. and the other one that says, well, it was a singularity with a beginning of time. And in fact, we've recently surveyed physicists on various topics, controversial topics in physics, and we're just about to publish this, I hope. It's sitting on my co-author's desk, and hopefully we're going to get this out soon. But there was, of all controversial topics within physics, the most consensus that we found was that the Big Bang should just be defined as a theory, not that says the universe had a beginning, but rather it evolved from a hot, dense state, in which case the multiverse and the Big Bang are perfectly compatible with each other.
Right, wow.
And in fact, a bouncing universe would be compatible with a bang as well, because that would also go through a hot, dense phase.
Wow. I want to give you both 30 seconds to just summarize your...
Could I just, before we do that,
Sure.
just say that I'm quite happy with everything you've said there, Phil, actually, and that as a Christian, I have no stake in which theory is right. They're all consistent with a creator God who brings anything into existence. So I'm not going to take one sides on one multiverse theory against another. I'm interested to find out. But there's another aspect of doing science which you're familiar with, and that is that theories are always underdetermined by experiments. In other words, you can get some evidence from experiments, and they could be explained by different theories. So you can have various theories, and one set of experiments or observations will not necessarily tell you which one is correct. And so that's a fundamental limitation, as it were, that we have to bear in mind. So I'm open to whatever the universe turns out to be and how it works. And I don't think that as a Christian I have any particular stake in one theory or another. I'm more concerned as a Christian with what the purpose of my life is and where it's going. It doesn't have a meaning and a purpose. And just to touch on the fine-tuning argument, Roger Penrose, who's a very famous cosmologist, mathematician in Oxford, he was the one who worked out what the degree of order had to be at the beginning of the universe that we have here. And things had to be set up with such a degree of order to end up with what we've got now, to 1 part in 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. A huge number, okay? That precision is just mind-blowing. That number is bigger than the number of protons in the universe. The degree of precision of getting the order in that early stage of the universe is just mind-blowing. And Roger Penrose is not a Christian, he's not a particularly religious person, but on the basis of his calculation, he said that it begins to look like the universe has a purpose. It's not there just somehow by chance. So the numbers and almost point him, as it were, in that direction. But of course, evidence will only take you so far. So that's what I'm just going to say, that as a Christian, I have no particular stake in whether multiverses are right or wrong. They're still within the creativity of God, who explains why there's something rather than nothing.
Phil, 30 seconds.
Okay, very quickly. I know Roger really well. You can go on my channel, Phil Halper, and I've got lots of interviews with Roger, and he discussed this very topic. So he had a picture in his book with a creator,
yes,
putting the pin in, and he said, that was a joke. I don't believe in a creator. It's right, what you say, Paul, but what Roger is trying to suggest is that the entropy of the early universe wasn't set by a random process. But that doesn't mean it was said by God or even a creator. We saw in evolution that you don't have to choose between randomness and intelligent design. What Roger is suggesting is that we live in a cyclic universe, and that part of that cyclic process is that it resets the entropy basically to zero. And that's why we have this incredibly low entropy state. And he's claiming that you can't explain this by anthropic reasoning. So neither God and a multiverse in those cases are what are called anthropic types of reasoning. You're basically saying humans are part of the explanation, if you like. In a multiverse, it's a self-selection effect. You know, you have to live in the universe that has life-permitting properties. For a theist, it's a God selection. You're God selecting a life-permitting universe. And Roger's saying it's neither of those. He thinks it's a cyclic universe. Well, that doesn't include God either. So that just isn't any evidence for God at all, particularly in Roger's mind, and I think he's right.
But I think Roger also, just chip in there, that Roger is also of the opinion that some models where the universe expanded and then collapsed again back to the original state, disobey the second law of thermodynamics, and he argues that the entropy at the end of that cycle would be even bigger than before, and so that kind of cycle doesn't work.
Yeah, he's proposing a different type of cyclic universe, one that doesn't expand and recollapse, but rather it expands and then it sort of resets itself in a particular way. You can watch our video on conformal cyclic cosmology and it all will be explained, but it is cyclic.
Excellent. Can we give both these gentlemen a huge round of applause? So who's got the first question? Yes. So Paul, earlier on we talked about pain and evolution. To you, is pain and suffering in evolution and creative processes really anathema to the idea of a good and just God?
Well, I have to confess that's one of the most difficult questions that I struggle with as a Christian, and how to fit that into my idea of a God who loves us and the world that he has made. At the same time, I want to see it as only part of the evidence that we have for God, because together with pain and suffering, and we know that pain actually has a purpose. It keeps us safe from certain things. When you touch something hot, the pain stops you destroying your hand, basically. So there's a purpose in pain, and there's a purpose in viruses and stimulating evolution and so on. If they get into the wrong place, then there's a problem, okay? Now, if you have a world in which God has to constantly intervene to stop things happening like that, then it would become patently obvious that something was going on here, that we would no longer be in control of ourselves, that God would be constantly interfering to stop that kind of suffering in that way. What he might be able to do is to transform the suffering into something for a good purpose. And sometimes that's hard to see. And human beings are strange creatures. Sometimes we inflict suffering on ourselves for a good reason. I'm not just talking about surgery where you go through a painful operation to remove a cancer, but we even put ourselves through pain to climb mountains and take risks. And we find that fulfilling as part of the whole experience of being alive. And some of the joys that we experience in love are enhanced because of the sense of loneliness that we've experienced before. And the joy of being healthy and being able to do things is enhanced if we've had a bad cold, or like I've got at the moment, or you've experienced suffering. So suffering is part of the rich tapestry of life, if you like. If everything was totally smooth running, perhaps we wouldn't be aware that there was any problems, as it were. C.S. Lewis said that something to the effect that God whispers to us in our joys, but he shouts to us in our sufferings. It's God's megaphone to a sleeping world, as it were, that the experience of pain and suffering can also stimulate others to alleviate it and bring out a channel for us to act in love and compassion for others. If we never had to do that, then our life would be the poorer, I think. So it's all part of a tapestry, if you like, of life. It's joys and sorrows to go together, in a sense, to make life what it is. Now, that's not a complete answer. I don't have a perfect answer to that question. It's a hard one. But in a sense, I think I know enough about God's love to think maybe there is an answer, and someday I'll find out.
Let's have a question for Phil. Does anyone have a question for Phil? Great question. Great question. Phil, what evidence would you need to change your mind?
So first off, I'd want an explanation as to why there is so much suffering. That seems to be the strongest evidence against God. So if you gave me a good explanation, that would reduce my confidence that there is no God. How about something like Bible passages in natural numbers? Maybe if we went to the nth decimal expansion of pi, we found ones and zeros and we decoded and it all spat out the Bible, that would be pretty convincing, but we don't see anything like that.
No. Paul, 10 seconds on what would change your mind.
Well, let me just briefly say on the question of suffering again, because there's a book in the Bible about it, and that's the book of Job. And Job argues with God to say, why is this happening? And at the end of it, God doesn't give him a reason, he gives him a relationship. And that transforms his understanding of his own suffering. He sees it in the bigger picture, as it were. So what evidence would convince me that God does not exist? I'm not sure. It's very difficult as a scientist to prove that something isn't there. You can prove something is there by detecting it, but proving that something isn't there is actually very difficult scientifically. And so...
What about if it was proven that Jesus didn't exist or didn't rise from the dead? Or
if it could be shown that Jesus either had never lived or that he didn't rise from the dead, that was some evidence that was totally convincing, that would shake my faith, yeah.
Okay, great. Next question. Right, so we've got a question there for you, Phil, about your comments earlier about science, maybe religion inhibiting the progress of science. But we got reference there that even without Newton and Boyle and those people we've mentioned earlier, you had eras like the Islamic Golden Age where science did take a great leap, or mathematics did. So what do you say to that?
There's no question the Islamic Golden Age made significant contributions to science, and I think it undermines the narrative we hear that Christianity invented science. Ibn al-Haytham, who lived about 1000 AD, I think made one of the most strongest contributions to science because he came up with the idea of controls for experiments. So the idea for experiments did not originate with Francis Bacon. It goes way before that. But of course, in that Arab Golden Age, they were rediscovering the ancient Greek texts. There was a caliph who really spent a lot of money trying to preserve the knowledge of the ancient Greeks. So now, as I said before, it's not all religious belief that hinders science, but particular types of religious belief. So fundamentalist religious belief is the big hindrance to science. And I don't think, those Islamic thinkers were fundamentalists. So I'm not claiming that all religion hinders scientific advancement, but rather a particular type of religion. And unfortunately, in the United States, for example, it's very prevalent, that type of religious belief. And in the Islamic world today, I mean, I've debated many Muslims, they don't even believe in evolution, which is a strongly established scientific fact. So again, I'm not making a blanket comment on all religion, but some religion.
Excellent. Well, we'll need to finish it there. Thank you so much for being a great audience and for your great questions. Can we have a round of applause again?